Welcome to Curiosity Cake, the podcast for curious minds with big appetites. I'm Lee Delaney. Each episode, I interview an expert from industry or academia to discuss topics across a buffet of tasty subjects. If you like what you hear, please tip generously by leaving a review on your podcast provider of choice. This helps to get the show noticed and attract more listeners. On this episode, I talk to Professor Emma Bell, an expert in authoritarianism. Emma is a professor of contemporary British politics at Savoie Mont-Blanc University in Chambéry, France. She has published widely in the UK and France on authoritarianism in the British state. She is the author of Criminal Justice and Neoliberalism and Soft Power and Freedom under the Coalition, and is a founding editor of the journal Justice, Power and Resistance. Her current research focuses on new forms of democracy and challenges to state authoritarianism. Curiosity Cake. Professor Emma Bell, welcome to Curiosity Cake.
Thanks for having me.
So you're particularly interested in the idea of authoritarianism. So what is it that took you into studying that as your specialised area?
Well, I suppose I became particularly interested in the 2000s about the so-called punitive turn and the massive increase that there appeared to be in the prison population at that time, the huge amount of legislation that was being passed on law and order topics. And I wanted to try and understand what exactly was going on. So what was really new about this compared to penal policies of the past? What political context, cultural, institutional context really led to that increase in authoritarianism in the field of law and order, which led me to publish a book in 2011 on criminal justice and neoliberalism. And then I kind of went beyond that to look at other forms of authoritarianism in British society, focusing particularly then on the coalition government, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government, and looking at the notion of soft power, so more subtle forms of authoritarianism that existed in various different areas of British society at that time. Which led me to publish my book, Soft Power and Freedom, under the coalition in 2015.
That's brilliant. You managed to get plugs for 2 books in there.
Yeah, there you go. May as well, hey? Get somebody to read them.
So if we get into it then, if we start right at the start with what authoritarianism actually is and what it looks like in practice.
Yeah, well, I suppose what most people would think about as authoritarianism, they would probably think back to Nazism or Stalinism as archetypal authoritarian regimes. Maybe today they might think of societies such as those in Saudi Arabia. They might think of China. And I suppose what we see there is the lack of political plurality with one party states trying to impose one particular ideology and trying to enforce that ideology using very coercive methods. We think of the police state, the attempt to control thought and action. We can associate all of that with totalitarianism, having total control over every single aspect of life.
And authoritarianism then is really contrasted to liberalism.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think of political liberalism as being the absence of coercion, particularly the absence of coercion from the state, the protection of individual liberty against the arbitrary power of the state. And also, I suppose, if we associate it with democracy and the notion of democratic pluralism, that it's possible to have opposition to the leading party. It's possible to have competing ideologies within the same state. But what I would suggest is that authoritarianism isn't necessarily opposed to liberalism, but that authoritarianism has always been present within liberalism to a certain extent. And if we go right back to the seeds of liberal thought, in Britain at least, if we go back to Hobbes, for example, Hobbes, few people would consider him to be a liberal, but certainly he's widely considered to have um, helped to theorize the notion of the social contract, because perhaps this is the first philosopher, I suppose, to really question why people will accept to be governed, and under what conditions they will accept to be governed. So he suggests that, of course, life without a government, life without any kind of political order would be anarchy, would be poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And so people accept to give up a certain amount of freedom, in fact, in order to have security from being killed by other people, to have their property taken from them by other people. So they're prepared to give up a certain amount of freedom in order to protect the most basic of freedoms, perhaps, which is security. And they're happy to have a very strong Leviathan state, as Hobbes said. So they're prepared to accept this authoritarianism in the name of liberty.
And Leviathan there as being
Lev-
the state itself.
Leviathan as being the state itself. So Leviathan, this can be a strong monarch. This could eventually be another kind of governor. But the idea is basically, once people have accepted to live under some kind of government, they can no longer challenge that power. And that is something that is refined somewhat under Locke's social contract theory, where he suggests that if the Leviathan, if the governor does not respect life, liberty, and property, the basic fundamental rights according to Locke, if the state does not respect those things, well, then the people have a right to overthrow that government. So they have a right to overthrow arbitrary power. And it's that kind of liberalism, that's Locke's theory, is really considered to be the very foundation of political liberalism today. But if we look at that in that practical application in the 18th and 19th centuries, well, we see that that's a liberty that liberties really only apply to certain individuals. There are plenty of individuals that are still considered to be appropriate targets of state coercion. You have slaves, you have working classes who are completely excluded from democracy, women, etc. So it's considered, and any kind of resistance on their part to the power of the governed tends to be brutally repressed.
Yeah, so we can see then that liberalism started to develop out of this more authoritarian idea, beginning with Hobbes, that Locke then made more liberal as we would think of it today. And then John Stuart Mill continued that liberalization process.
Well, Locke, he has this idea that there is a right on the part of people to resist arbitrary power, but this only applies to certain people who have a right to resist arbitrary power. Mill seems to go beyond that with his harm principle. When he defines liberty, he becomes much more concerned, perhaps, about more positive forms of liberty. He's not just talking about freedom from the state, but freedom to do certain things. And under his harm principle, he suggests that you basically, as an individual, you have the freedom to do whatever you want, so long as you don't harm other people. But even with Mill, we still see a certain aspect of authoritarianism there. He still believes that the state can play a strong role in trying to create a morally perfect society. He still believes in very harsh measures, coercive measures for those who do harm to others. He was notably very critical of who he described as the humanity mongers, the penal reformers who he considered were too lenient on criminals. And also, along with all of those other liberal thinkers, such as Locke, he did believe that despotism and tyrannical rule was appropriate for some uncivilized societies, so for colonial societies that he didn't believe were mature enough for liberal government.
Is there an issue there then, if we go back and think about Hobbes and his idea of a war of all against all, the anarchy on an international level, but within an individual country, everyone with their own selfish interests, looking to satisfy their own needs, and in some form of conflict? Is there something to that idea of Mill then, of countries and states having to go through some sort of process where some sort of authoritarian ruler or system actually creates a nation state, maybe in particular, that then sets up the possibility of liberalism itself later on?
Yeah, I suppose you can see a direct line linking Hobbes to Mill in some way there, absolutely. I mean, certainly Mill believed that people needed to be educated in liberal ideas before they could be entrusted with political power. This is why, for example, he believes in plural voting, the idea that the educated should have, that their vote should have much more weight in the democratic system than that of the uneducated.
So from Mill, then liberalism is developed further by the new liberals. Can you tell us about who they were?
Yeah, well, the new liberals, new liberalism, it does emerge to a certain extent out of Mill, since Mill is talking about positive freedom. And the new liberals, they become particularly interested not just in this negative freedom from the arbitrary power of the state, but they believe in the need for individuals to have the positive freedom to realize their full potential. So you have thinkers such as Hobhouse and Green, and they suggest that if the state takes a completely hands off approach, as the liberals argued for following classical liberalism and economic liberalism in the 19th century, they believe that if the state took that completely hands off approach, that people wouldn't necessarily have real freedom. And certainly, what we see in the 19th century, and particularly with the first kind of social surveys towards the end of the 19th century, is that poverty is a significant problem. And basically, they believe that individuals are not genuinely free until they are freed from poverty. So they believe that there is a need for a certain degree of state interventionism in order to free people from poverty and give them that positive freedom to realize their full potential. So if necessary, that means that the state can interfere in the free market, as I suppose it did in 1909 with the People's Budget, the first redistributive budget ever, which imposed very heavy taxes on land ownership in order to fund new schemes such as the 1908 Old Age Pension Fund. That is all justified in the name of giving people this new kind of liberty. But even there, we see that there's a certain element of authoritarianism that was actually resisted by the left and by the syndicalists in particular, who believed that the state was taking away the control that they wanted to have as workers. So, for example, but before there was any kind of national insurance system, which was introduced by Asquith's Liberal Party in 1911, you had a system of mutual aid in the friendly societies, with employees contributing to their own social insurance schemes to protect them against the risk of sickness, unemployment, injury at work, etc. And there was a certain resentment that the state was taking on this role and was forcing a compulsory insurance system on workers, whereas previously that had been a voluntary insurance system. So even though it was meant to be providing people with liberty, freeing them from poverty, there was a resistance to a certain element of state authoritarianism there.
So there's a contrast there between who's responsible for creating or protecting those freedoms. Is it the state, or in the case of syndicalists, workers
Yeah,
themselves?
absolutely. Yeah.
And then I guess with the new liberals, we're really talking there about a process that has gone from authoritarianism, monarchy, through these new liberal ideas with Locke and Mill, that's then really coming up to something that looks like socialism coming up into the 20th century.
Yeah, certainly. And there are clear parallels between socialism and the new liberalism, to the extent that both the new Labour Party and the Liberal Party were able to form pacts in the early part of the century, electoral pacts. And we see that the foundations of the welfare state are really laid under the new liberal government at the beginning of the century, and then taken forward by the Labour Party. And of course, we shouldn't forget that the chief architect of the welfare state in Britain, Beveridge, was indeed a liberal there as well. So new liberalism, it does lead very much into socialism. And what we start to see then are criticisms, perhaps particularly from the right, about the authoritarian tendencies of socialism.
So that takes us up to around the period of the Second World War, and after we started off talking about the Nazis and Stalin as kind of archetypes of what authoritarianism looks like at its most extreme.
Yeah.
And interestingly, they're versions of authoritarianism from the left and from the right.
Mhm.
So as we start to come out of the war, post 1945, how is authoritarianism and responses to it looking from the point of view of the left and the right at that time?
Well, from the right, then you have, for example, Friedrich Hayek writing The Road to Serfdom in 1945, who is very much going against the grain of thought at that time, whereby Keynesianism was very widely accepted, state interventionism in the economy, state interventionism in social policy. He's going against the grain there and suggesting that just no matter what the best intentions are of the socialists, socialism will always lead to totalitarianism. He basically talks about the ratchet effect. He says that the more power you give to the state, the more power that it will accrue, and it will just keep accruing that power to such an extent that it will eventually turn into this totalitarian state. And those ideas, they are picked up in Britain, but they don't become widespread really until the 1970s. They're picked up in Britain, for example, with Anthony Fisher when he founded the Institute for Economic Affairs, the think tank, which had the express aim of trying to spread Hayek's ideas in Britain through writing pamphlets, speaking to the press, etc. So you have that criticism from the right. And what you also start to see, perhaps not quite so soon, but you do start to see a criticism from the left. So you see a criticism from the left as the left begins to understand what is happening in the USSR. You see a criticism, obviously, of Stalinism as the authoritarianism starts to become clear there. But also, quite interestingly, what you see on the left is a criticism in Britain and in Western countries, Western liberal democracies. You start to see a criticism of the authoritarian side to the state there. So you see, for example, well, perhaps a little bit later on, you see people like Stuart Hall describing the state as being essentially a benevolent dictatorship. So the idea that yes, it is trying to do good, but that people's experience of the state is that it is coercive, it is authoritarian, it is this huge bureaucracy, it is complex, it is alienating, it's difficult to negotiate. You see criticism of nationalisation, the way that nationalisation has taken place. Nationalisation that never really did give workers or users of those services any real control over how exactly they functioned. And we start to see, I suppose, in the revolts of the 1960s, this demand to take back control. We always hear that today in the context of the Brexit debate, but that desire to take back control from the state, I suppose, has a long history. So you see the revolts of the 1960s demanding greater control in the workplace. You see revolts also against the moral authoritarianism that you see within the state institutions, educational institutions, and a desire you see, for example, students wanting a new model of education, a new kind of dialogue. There's a desire to move away from this top-down control from the state, from centralism, towards more towards the creation of more power, or the adoption of more power by the individual.
So moving away from the idea of people as collectives, as citizens of a country, as members of particular groups, to emphasize individual rights.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose collectivism is experienced very negatively. Collectivism is experienced as statism, as a form of authoritarianism. And yeah, there's a desire to take back individual control, for people to be recognized as individuals. So
And across the 20th century, obviously, you had the Cold War, this kind of conflict between economic left, economic right, that's kind of summed up in this Hayek versus Keynesian
mm.
kind of models.
Yes, the idea, I suppose, that state interventionism, we see it being associated very, very much with the left, and then the right manages to take up these criticisms, these very legitimate, real criticisms of the state, whether they're from the left or from the right, and focus more on the individual, moving away from collectivism, but they tend to subsume these desires for freedom into economic freedom.
So they start to use the language of wider liberalism to bring about kind of liberalism within the market.
Yeah, exactly. They see market freedom as the precondition for all other kinds of freedom.
So this use of the concept of liberty and freedom from the right to protect and support kind of economic freedoms, is this the beginning of the development of soft authoritarianism?
I would say that it is, because these criticisms, they are taken seriously, and we seem to have an apparent rolling back of the state, with this recognition of the individual and individual power as opposed to state power. But in reality, there's just a difference, I suppose, in the way that power is exercised. So you do see a certain kind of hard power does continue to be exercised, some more obvious forms of authoritarianism, but particularly we do see this exercise of soft power. And this is really where I focus on how coercion is still used, state authority is still used, but that power becomes much more diffuse. It's not maybe exercised absolutely directly by the state, but via a number of different actors, particularly by the private sector. And it tends to be dressed up in a very different discourse. It's dressed in the language of liberalism, it's dressed in the language of individual empowerment. But I would argue that it has actually done very little to empower and has rather had an effect of disempowerment. And you see that really with the right, the Thatcherite right particularly, which picks up on this discourse of freedom. So, as I said, it focuses on economic freedom. It sees economic freedom as being the best means of realizing individual freedom. So, you can do this, you're giving individuals more freedom in the market, as market actors, as consumers in particular. But that's done through privatization. So, people no longer have to go to one electricity provider, one phone provider. They have that individual choice and they can exercise their individual freedom of choice in the market. They're also promoting entrepreneurial freedom. And to do so, that does justify the use of the strong state. This is what Andrew Gamble picked up on very clearly when he was writing about the Thatcher years, just at the end of the 1980s, when he talked about the free economy and the strong state. So the idea that a strong state was justified in order to try to make the market free. And here, this isn't such a subtle form of authoritarianism. There you saw very direct form of authoritarianism. We can think of the clash between the government and the miners, who were described as the enemy within. I think many of us can certainly remember, or we've seen images of those clashes between the miners and the police in the 1980s. So certainly the police as a symbol of the power of the state are invoked there to try to give economic freedom back to the entrepreneur.
And you can see at the same time here efforts to support that economic freedom through other spheres of society, like social, moral, kind of legal aspects of society.
Absolutely, Margaret Thatcher. There's a quote from Margaret Thatcher that is very often repeated, and that was that economics is the method, but the aim was to change the heart and soul. And absolutely, it was very, very important for Thatcher to try to bring about the cultural change, to try to create the legal, social, and moral order that would be conducive to economic freedom. And there, I think that there's a certain inspiration from the ordo-liberalism of the 1930s, whereby the state should try to create what Alexander Rostow described as a vital politic. The vital politic was this kind of cultural revolution that would help, that would be favourable to economic freedom. So the idea was to try to engineer cultural change from above, and in very subtle ways that were not necessarily experienced as authoritarianism. We can see how Thatcher, for example, was able to encourage home ownership, an extraordinarily popular policy. This was through the right to buy scheme, giving people living in council housing the possibility to buy their own homes, to become homeowners, to participate in this entrepreneurial society. The idea of privatization, this was sold as furthering popular capitalism, enabling ordinary people to buy shares, even though ultimately share ownership was still concentrated very much amongst the economic elites. there was this idea that everybody could play a part in the entrepreneurial society. And we see this also in Thatcher's efforts to try to change the welfare state and the negative culture that she claimed the welfare state had brought into being, well, what she described as the dependency culture, the idea that people had become trapped in dependency, trapped in poverty. Again, that notion that the welfare state was not liberating as it was meant to have been, but that the welfare state was coercive. And in response, Thatcher actually ends up introducing further forms of coercion to try to force people off benefits, to try to make benefits more conditional, and to try to bring about a different kind of morality. There's a certain moral authoritarianism here, that those people who are not working, that are not pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps, are deserving of these more coercive kind of interventions. And indeed, she talked about the need to heal moral cripples, those who were considered to be incapable of taking on personal responsibility.
So that's a sense then of how Thatcher and the right at that time were really pushing a kind of moral authoritarianism. But then as we come up to the end of the 90s with New Labour, that maybe changes more to a sort of moral liberalism.
Yeah, well, it certainly appears that way. I mean, Thatcherism is very much associated with a kind of moral conservatism. She harks back to Victorian values of thrift and hard work, but also she refers back to the traditional values of the family. Hence, you see the imposition of Section 28, for example, preventing the teaching of homosexuality as a normal relationship in schools. And then once we move towards New Labour, we see a deliberate attempt to try to move away from that kind of moral authoritarianism. Certainly, New Labour appears to be more in touch with morally liberal values. We see the reduction of the age of consent for homosexual relations, the repeal of Section 28, even though that didn't actually come until 2003. So it certainly appears to be a huge break from Thatcherism, but there is a continuation of that moral authoritarianism from the Thatcher years, particularly in the way that New Labour defines the good citizen. For New Labour, the good citizen, rather like Thatcher, is the independent citizen, the responsible citizen, the citizen that tries to tackle his or her own situation of poverty by getting into the workforce. Work is seen as the magical solution to poverty, ignoring, of course, the problem of the working poor. I think we see some acceptance under New Labour of Charles Murray's notion of the moral underclass. Charles Murray, who the American sociologist who was particularly influential in the 1980s and then into the 1990s, more in Britain, where he talked about a moral underclass, poor people who were poor because of their own values, because they did not have the necessary respect for the values of hard work and individual responsibility. And we do see that to a certain extent in Labour's New Deal for the unemployed, where you see a formalisation of the conditionality that Thatcher has already introduced into the welfare system. You're considered worthy of aid and assistance provided that you accept the responsibilities that the state expects you to.
And of course, then New Labour particularly moved away from the kind of general perceived softness of the left around crime. Crime very much being justified by poverty in a bit of a blanket way that left no individual responsibility. But Blair really moved Labour from that with his famous tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime.
Yeah, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, but there was a particular interpretation of those causes of crime, just like the causes of poverty. The causes of crime were essentially seen to result from individual causes, a lack of individual responsibility, rather than from structural causes. And in doing that, New Labour was taking up the ideas of left realism, which was a trend in criminology that saw that crime was a real problem, and particularly for the poorest people in society. They are the people who suffer most from crime. So this was considered to be, this was a way that the topic of crime, the topic of law and order, could be appropriated by the left. Dealing with law and order could be presented as a left wing issue, since tackling the problem of crime was a way of tackling of improving the conditions of the poorest, the living conditions of the poorest members of society. However, New Labour seemed to take what it wanted out of left realism, because the left realist criminologists, they did also, whilst they said that crime needed to be taken seriously by left-wing parties, they did also say that the key causes of crime were structural, really, rather than individual. Whereas New Labour really tended, as I say, to focus on individual causes, and particularly social problems such as school truancy, for example, were reinterpreted as crime problems. I suppose New Labour became very interested in early intervention, so tackling the causes of crime, trying to tackle the causes of crime before it actually happens. And the causes of crime were often defined as things like school truancy, or family problems, absent fathers, etc. So this tended to justify state intervention, social interventions into family life, widening, therefore, then the social control by the state, and those social interventions then that could escalate eventually into penal interventions if they were seen to be ineffective with regard to preventing crime. So what we see really in these years are, we see a huge development and a reinforcement of the kind of authoritarian populism that Stuart Hall first identified with Thatcher. What I mean by that is that that New Labour, it takes real fears, real concerns about crime, and instrumentalizes those for political gain, to try to show that, to try to distinguish itself from the Labour Party of the past that was, quite wrongly, but was often perceived to have been soft on crime, to try to take some political gain from the right.
That then takes us up to really the end of the New Labour era and into the last decade when Cameron comes on the scene.
Yeah, certainly. And here again, well, we see Cameron desperately trying to differentiate the Conservatives from Thatcher, and from Blair, and to try to show that they're representing something new. So to try to differentiate themselves from the Blair years, the Conservatives at this time, they focus on liberty again. They focus on the notion of freedom. And it was perceived that, and I think quite rightly, it was perceived that New Labour had become increasingly authoritarianism through the centralisation of power, through attacks on civil liberties. The Conservative Party was particularly critical of some of the anti-terror measures that were introduced by New Labour. They were particularly critical of the idea of creating a national identity card system, for example. And they said that when they came to power, they would change these things. They did indeed scrap the ID card system. With regard to anti-terror measures, however, I think there was a great continuity. But they also believed, Cameron also believed, that it was necessary to differentiate the party from Thatcherism. So to detoxify the party.
He was very like a cuddly conservative.
He tried to be a cuddly conservative, the hug-a-husky, hug-a-hoodie conservative, of course, trying to show the
Compassionate
conservative, a
conservatism.
compassionate conservative, as opposed to the perceived lack of compassion of the Thatcher era. Thatcher, who was often seen to be uncaring, who had fostered the selfish society. Theresa May, back in 2001, had said that the party couldn't get elected because it had become known as the nasty party. So David Cameron, absolutely, he made this attempt to try to move away from this image of the nasty party. And so the whole idea of the big society, that was a really good way of trying to show that the party was different from Thatcher. Thatcher, of course, who had become really well known for having suggested that there was no such thing as society. What Cameron said was there is such a thing as society, it's just not the same as the state, which is actually exactly what Thatcher had said. Thatcher didn't really believe that there wasn't such a thing as society. Thatcher did believe in society. She believed that individuals should help each other through charitable work, etc., just that they shouldn't depend on the state. So it was kind of exactly the same thing that Cameron was saying, but he was marketing that in a very different way. So the idea with his big society was that power would be transferred from the state to society, right, in order to give individuals more freedom. So more freedom, for example, to set up their own schools, parental choice, rather than accepting the schools that are necessarily provided by the state. The idea that they could create their own schools with their own curriculum, their own teachers, etc. What we saw in the big society, however, was that it tended to be more the private sector that filled in for the state. The majority of functions that were contracted out from the state to the big society did end up going to the private sector, simply because the voluntary sector does not necessarily have the financial wherewithal or the technical knowledge to bid for those very complex government contracts. And very often what we see was that local authorities, individuals, they weren't they were given responsibilities for trying to solve local problems, but at the end of the day, they weren't necessarily given a massive amount of new control or really empowered. The power of the state continued to be very significant there. And there's also a continued kind of moral liberalism, what David Cameron described as muscular liberalism here. He used that term with regard to migrants in his criticism of multiculturalism. He suggested that society needed to be, the state in particular, needed to be much more active in terms of trying to ensure that ethnic minorities were better integrated into British society. So he's focusing there on the state trying to change values, trying to ensure that the values of ethnic minorities and migrant communities correspond to the values, the dominant values of the British state. But I think that this muscular liberalism also applied to British people, and particularly to welfare claimants. The idea that the state should take on a much more coercive role in order to tackle the negative so-called culture of worklessness, and to try to force people into more responsibility again.
So what's happening on the left during the past decade, as well as Cameron is developing his big society ideas?
Well, what has been happening on the left is there does seem to have been well, I suppose you've two different trends. There is one trend where there is a kind of a move towards a certain amount of authoritarianism, which we see in the attempt to control free speech. In order to play to certain identity politics. But on the other hand, we do also have a move towards much more liberalism, much more political liberalism in the sense of empowerment. So I think that there's been an attempt to try to perhaps redefine positive freedom, whereas positive freedom was thought to only be able to come from the state. Through the welfare state. It was only the welfare state that could give you the social security net that would protect you from poverty. Recently, I think there has been a lot of thinking on the left about how that positive freedom can be translated into individual empowerment and taking power away from the state, giving it to individuals and communities to give them more control over public services. So rather than having a top-down approach to nationalisation, getting individuals involved in taking part in decision-making processes about how those services are run, about economic democracy in the workplace. Worker participation schemes. There you do have empowerment and responsibility, giving workers the possibility to play a greater role in decision-making processes, and also to take on some of the risks and benefits of the company. So to be given salary increases when the company is doing well, and then possibly to accept some wage decreases if things are not going so well. And also the notion of simply having more political democracy through organising things such as citizens' assemblies, ways in which public policy can be discussed at a more local level. So I think there has been thinking recently on moving away from the traditional state market dichotomy that we see between left and right, to look at where other centres of power might lie, to favour pluralism over statism, and pluralism in terms not just of political parties, but in terms of developing multiple sites of power. So I suppose what we're suggesting here is that there is a possibility maybe to have a genuine big society, but not a big society that involves the state still playing a significant role in transferring or perhaps governing in partnership more with the private sector, but really enabling individuals and communities to take on a bit more power.
Emma Bell, that's really fascinating discussion of authoritarianism. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Do you want to plug your books again before
No, that'll
we finish
do.
the episode?
I think once will do.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode. You can find out more about the podcast and upcoming episodes at curiositycake.co.uk and on Twitter at curiosity_cake. Curiosity Cake.